Thank you, and thank you, Mark and Jessica, and thank you all for being with us so early this morning to talk about what I think is a very important and sensitive topic for our country and for the world as well. And just as a bit of background, while I have a very, very strong background in enforcement, I also worked 13 years outside the country, processing refugees in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. I finalized the opening of the first permanent INS office in Havana, Cuba. Before we had diplomatic relations, I was the assistant officer in charge at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin during the Mariel boat lift. And just goes to show that, thank the good Lord, I've been around forever. But I've been able to serve my country in a great profession. So I had a lot of experience with asylum seekers, with refugee seekers, and of course in the human smuggling aspect. And we talked about the Haitians that are coming in, transiting Mexico, Central America, and this has been a tradition also, and by Cubans as well. But where's the tie-in? We have Cubans coming into Mexico, orchestrated by human smuggling organizations because they know that once they get into Mexico and then actually enter the United States, they're home free because of our special agreement we have with Cuba. Well, we see that over the years, as Jessica mentioned, that has gone on in a little bit of a different way because the Cubans ultimately, after less than a couple of years, are eligible to become permanent residents. Others that are seeking that status in the United States might not get legal permanent residence, but once they make that application, they might get a permit to work. They get a permit to be in the country. So it's almost the equivalent of having a legal resident status without having received a green card. They're eligible to work, so they're in the United States. And for the most part, the removal of many of these folks is not at the rate of denials that are happening throughout the country. There's one other factor before we get into the hunt for Maan Singh that I'd like to share. Recently, Venezuela has seen a great number of their citizens applying for status in the United States because of the conditions, whether it's economic or the government. And there was something ironic that happened a few weeks ago. You saw the figures that Jessica put up there with Houston, the number of applications that they have there is huge, which is the area that they process the highest number in the United States. But I was asked by this lady who lives in Miami, who's from Venezuela, and actually I think has a reasonable claim, if she should transfer her petition to Houston or actually change her address to Houston because it would process it much, much faster than in Miami. So it kind of gives you an idea of how easy it is to manipulate the system. Now, mind you that our country is a welcoming country, and we extend our arms and we help people throughout the world, but we also need to be strong in the enforcement, the security of our border, and the security of the interior communities of the United States, because I think sometimes we have a big issue. We say, well, we can't deal with this until we shut the border down. Ladies and gentlemen, actually, we not only have to secure the borders, we have to secure the interior parts of the United States. A.J. was a Joint Task Force coordinator after 9/11. If he were to share some of the stories of what happened inside the United States, inside some of the communities, you know, it's a great concern because we've seen recently, for example, in Texas, where we've had at least five people indicted since 2011 that either entered as, some of them entered as refugees, were admitted into the country, and ultimately were proven to have ties to some terrorist organizations. As a matter of fact, there was one that pled guilty this week that had entered the United States in this particular status. But coming back to what Jessica was talking about for the hunt for Maan Singh, I'm proud that in my 30 years, we pursued some of the hardest cases, the human smugglers, wherever they were at. Niranjan Maan Singh was based in Ecuador.
While he's connecting that, I'd just like to say, to tie Jessica's presentation with the book, is that smuggling organizations, whether it be narcotics or people, they have a very effective intelligence gathering system. And I say this, I get criticized a lot, it's much more effective than what we have in the U.S. government because they share. They'll share the information amongst organizations, and then they move people for each other and share the profits. So when there's a process like asylum, or there's some kind of policy that happens here that affects detention or your ability to get a parole or whatever here in the United States, it travels in the intelligence, the criminal organization's intelligence network. The other thing is, the tie-in is that when people from other countries arrive in Mexico, it becomes a springboard into the United States. That's why in this case we went farther. We went south. We went down to South America and targeted an organization that was operating there. Smugglers like to operate far away from the United States because they believe that they'll never be arrested, and if they are charged, indicted with some kind of crime, that they'll never actually be brought to the United States and brought to justice. So that's kind of a tie-in, and then as soon as we get this PowerPoint up, we'll go on to the other thing.
Our policies actually give the smuggling organizations a product to sell, and that is the strong likelihood that if someone takes that long journey through whatever route and makes it to the U.S. border, that it's very likely that they're going to succeed in their effort to stay in the United States. Before, one of the things I learned when I visited a couple of the ports of entry was that the policy change happened before 1996. People were often sent to our consulate or embassies inside, or our embassy and consulates inside Mexico to make their asylum application and wait there. They weren't immediately allowed to come into the United States, and that was a big difference in their likelihood of success.
You know, and going back to Operation Seek and Keep, if you look at the news there, we had a press conference in November 1998. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about almost 20 years ago. So, is it relevant today with the same thing going on back then? And A.J. mentioned that we pursued Niranjan Maan Singh, who, by the way, had set up his operation in Quito, Ecuador, and it's 2,002 miles from the southernmost part of Texas. So it kind of gives you an idea. He felt insulated. He was protected. He had officials that were working with him in Ecuador. And Jessica mentioned something that was extremely important. They had direct flights from Cuba. They were coming in with people that did not visas. They were allowed to stay. They were given a permit to stay for 3 days. And of course, we all knew that that was just an entry point into Ecuador. They were being received by Maan Singh. And he had an extensive organization. If you'll go back to the map that we had for the operation back then, you look at where it was coming from. You had people coming from India, Pakistan. We ultimately had individuals from Syria, Iran, Iraq that were using the smuggling organization, one part of the organization or other. But this was one of the most common routes, whether they started in India, going into Moscow, going into Cuba, the Bahamas. Ultimately, you see the point going down from Cuba into Quito, Ecuador. And then you see the journey being started northward, whether it was by boat, by plane, or by land. And it kind of gives you an idea. So coming back to give you a little bit of a story on Niranjan Maan Singh, this is one of the pictures that was taken of him in Quito, Ecuador. And I'll let A.J. give you a little bit of a history on Mr. Maan Singh.
Well, Maan Singh was a notorious smuggler. He had been detected by many intelligence agencies. Unfortunately, going back to the intelligence sharing, we didn't know about it as agents on the ground. Nobody knew about it. When I was first invited into a task force meeting and they talked about him, I had no idea who he was, and I had to read about 100 pages of intel and go, oh, okay, this guy's pretty significant smuggler. A few years before we started this investigation, he was actually on a large cargo ship in Nova Scotia that was full of about 200 aliens. And it was interdicted by the Canadian Navy. Maan Singh was taken into custody, and he was put on bond, and he fled. He just took off. But he continued operating. He moved around Central America, the Caribbean, and ended up in Quito, Ecuador. If anything ran through Ecuador and then later Venezuela, Maan Singh had a finger. He was actually the godfather of smuggling in that area. Now, other organizations operated, I don't want to mislead you, but in order to operate through his route or in his territory, he had to be paid. And that's how he kind of grew to prominence.
And if you look at the picture on the right, The one on the left is actually Mr. Maan Singh before the investigation. The one on the right is after we had already done the indictment in 1998. A.J. mentioned something that's extremely important. We did not have the intelligence sharing that it was so magnified after 9/11, and Mr. Maan Singh fled because of we had some obstacles that we had to overcome here in Washington D.C. with our headquarters pressuring us to take the case down. Mr. Maan Singh and I had some conversations by telephone, and he was 2 weeks away from actually being arrested, and we were ordered to take the operation down. Mr. Maan Singh fled, and ultimately, one thing that I hope that we get across on this message, we were always told we couldn't do it, but we would never take no for an answer. And even after the indictment was done, we had arrests all over the country and several places outside the United States. A.J. and I continued, even as our career moved on, we continued tracking Mr. Maan Singh, and we found this, and we got this picture of Mr. Maan Singh in Venezuela, where he had fled. Ultimately, he was brought to justice. And so what we did when we started doing this investigation, we actually took what we call a two-pronged approach. One of the things that was being done at the time was that they were taking migrants and they were putting them on vessels similar to the one you see there, El Almirante. And they, on this particular vessel, when we went undercover, they were going to put 28 people in this small fishing vessel. You can imagine how hard it is to travel out there. If you've ever been out at sea, if you're not used to it, you know how difficult it can be. But it's just an idea of how hard it is for people coming to the country. But that's not a cheap fare. They were paying anywhere from $25,000 to $35,000 to get to the United States. We ultimately had a very difficult part with this particular phase of the operation because we were required to monitor this boat with stringent guidelines from the Department of Justice. We had to know where it was at all times. But of course, we were not on the boat, so it became very difficult. They hit a storm, and they were lost at sea for a period of time. And the Department of Justice made us stop the undercover operation until we found that boat. And it was not an easy thing. We were glad that ultimately it landed. We didn't know. Then the Department of Justice required that before we were allowed to continue, that A.J. and I had to personally see the people that had been transported in that vessel. Now, mind you that they were in Central America. Well, we didn't take no for an answer, so A.J. and I traveled to the mountains of Guatemala and went and met with the people that were on that boat. Of course, we didn't tell them we were agents, but ultimately came back with a picture, and we were allowed to continue. I'll let A.J. talk a little bit about the air approach.
Did you tell them you were social workers?
Actually, we took a picture and we left.
From a human rights organization?
Yeah.
The two-pronged approach here was, and it goes back to what Jessica said in her original presentation, is the land route is difficult. To go from Ecuador or from anywhere in South America all the way up to Central America and into Mexico is very difficult. It's a long trip, but there's a lot of different countries you go through. There's a lot of terrain. It's dangerous. You face injury, drowning in some of the rivers and lakes, being robbed. And so these were the alternative routes that they started using. The boat, the vessel scheme was being used. But what we saw they were overloading these vessels. We've seen pictures of just, standing room only on these 40-foot, 60-foot fishing vessels. Obviously, that was dangerous. So when Maan Singh was going to use this, we tried to take control of it so that we could limit the number of passengers that would be on this. So we could do an effective undercover operation, but minimize the risk to the passengers. And then, so secondly, in this case started with a pilot, a commercial pilot that was recruited by Maan Singh. He flew down to the border in South Texas, and then he'd fly groups of people back and forth. That ended up in a big mess. You can read about it in the book if you like. But this is him. He wanted to be a commercial pilot all of his life. That's why he was smuggling aliens, is because he was getting miles. He was getting hours flying back and forth.
And getting paid.
He didn't realize how much. He was only getting paid a little bit of money until he realized exactly what he was doing. One time, the smugglers had asked him to fly relatives, cousins, and so he's Pakistani. They were mostly Indian, And he noticed on about his 6th or 7th trip that one of the cousins was Mexican. So he inquired, what's going on? Do we have relatives in Mexico? This guy doesn't. And they said, well, actually, you're smuggling people. And he said, well, then you need to pay me more than $100 a trip. And so he started to get greedy as the trip went on. Anyways, he wanted to be a pilot, a commercial pilot. We were monitoring his activity and miscommunication and other things. He was arrested in San Antonio by our San Antonio office without, we were a task force, but San Antonio didn't call and say, hey, we're going to arrest this guy. They weren't supposed to. They were supposed to surveil him. So that screwed up our investigation. So we had to come up with an alternative plan. So I was just thinking, kind of brainstorming, and I just said, why don't we bring him on American Airlines? That's as safe as it gets. American Airlines, I'm based in Dallas, Texas. That's where their base is in Fort Worth. So they said, you know anybody in American Airlines? I said, no. I just looked it up and called their corporate security office and started talking to this guy. I told him who I was, told him our plan. He said he'd get back to me within a couple of days. We had approval as long as we were able to get an approved undercover operation from the Department of Justice. And that's what we did. We worked with American Airlines. They allowed our passengers, we were undercover, we were smuggling for Maan Singh to board. Now, the part of that I guess you have to understand is that if the airlines is responsible, if they bring people to the United States and that person doesn't have a proper travel document, then they got to take them back and also face fines. So what we were going to do, we just kind of indemnified American Airlines. We said, no, work with us, trust us, we're the government. We won't fine you, we won't make you take anybody back. And it turned out to be a great partnership because it was safe. But the best part of it is when Maan Singh and his organization heard, we don't have to go the land route, we don't have to overload boats, we can just put them on commercial airlines, they went crazy. They said, we're going to start moving people. In fact, they wanted to start moving other people, women and children, and charging more money because the dangerous route was, they didn't want to subject the women and children to that. They wanted to put them on American Airlines. So that's how that was our two-pronged approach. It took a lot of work to get approved by the Department of Justice. Eventually, after they told us no 3 or 4 times and we went over their head, we didn't make any friends within our agency, but we got approval to do it.
Yeah, and AJ is entirely correct. When we're talking about the number of people coming into the country, we on that first trip with El Almirante, there was 23 migrants that were coming into the United States. But if you were to see pictures of the other vessels that were being used at that time and are being used today, by the way, you would see vessels that would have 80, 130, 180. I think the largest number in one vessel was 223 on a 40-foot vessel. You can imagine 223 people in the cargo area of the vessel. So it was dangerous, but it was being used. And one other thing that I want to be very clear about. This operation on the air approach was fantastic for us, but AJ mentioned it took a lot of work. One is because we had to vet every single person through every single agency, through the CIA, through the FBI, intel communities, before we would allow them to board that airplane coming into the United States. Now, we did the best we could. Could we guarantee that safety or the security of the United States? I don't think that anybody can ever say we're 100% guaranteed. And I think that I say that because it's relevant to what happens today when we have people coming to the country that want to apply for refugee status from countries where they have been perhaps in camps for 2 or 3 years. We cannot really establish who that person is, where they have been, who they have met. But we had that threshold even back then. And it was very difficult, and I think we have those challenges even today.
Poli, just one question. Did the people that, as part of your undercover operation, you were checking out before you smuggled them in?
Oh, yes.
Did they know that they were being part of an undercover? I mean, how do you do background? I mean, smugglers don't ask people, well, I'm going to do a background check on you before I take your money.
I'll answer that. It was the same concern we had is we've worked undercover for our entire careers, but how do we get these guys to give us their true credentials? We just asked for them, and they did.
Okay.
And our informant in Ecuador would fax me copies of their passports every page of the passport so I could see where they'd entered and exited, their pictures, their biographical data, and that's what we used to run our background investigation.
So were there any people that you had to turn down and say, no, I'm not going to take your money to smuggle you in because I'm so honest?
No.
Okay, well,
No. There were some that they were trying to get into the pipeline, but we cut them off early. Said, no, we're not going to move those people.
Yeah, we had certain nationalities that we would not
I see.
deal with. So that was another layer, Mark, that we would use to certainly not stereotype, but not put ourselves in a position where anything could happen. And by the way, even if this case was over, our internal affairs people and our oversight committees, for a year, I think we had to continually answer for the people that we brought into the country, notwithstanding they have been vetted by every single agency that worked with us during that particular time. So it was arduous and it was time consuming, and ultimately we ended up having to go undercover ourselves because when we first started the operation, I was already a senior officer with the agency. I had already been with our agency for over 20 years. As a matter of fact, I had been in so long that even my son was an agent by that time, but I was still working. I was still working undercover. It's very unusual to find somebody who's head of an office actually doing undercover work because it doesn't mean you don't do your other taskings. But I was lucky that I partnered up with A.J. Irwin because he was phenomenal. And we decided to pursue it not only from the smuggling aspect, but from two other areas that I think are worth mentioning today. And I'll let A.J. get into the money.
Yeah, at this time is when the Immigration and Naturalization Service had first received authority to do a wiretap, to investigate RICO cases, and they put some of the INS immigration crimes within INA, made them predicating factors for a RICO prosecution. So the assistant U.S. attorney that decided to take this case took it on the condition that we made it a wiretap, the first wiretap. So the way that I sat and thought about this, and I talked to people, talked to my dad, who's a retired customs agent, is we went back to the old adage, follow the money. And I know from all of my experience in investigating smuggling cases that there, especially from India, Pakistan, that there's somebody here in the United States that's handling all the money in and out, and they call it hawala, is their underground system of banking. I'd worked a case before where a CPA from India had explained this to me, and I had no idea what he was talking about, but I made notes, and I tried to understand what he was talking about. So when we got into this, we sent, Poli had an informant that we sent to Ecuador, and he was a great informant. Poli introduced him to me, and I talked to him on the phone 4 or 5 times a day. And he was telling me about Maan Singh, about passengers, about the El Almirante, boat, everything. And every time I'd say, what about the money? I badgered him he got so tired of hearing me talking about it. It took about 6 weeks, and he called me Andres. He said, okay, I got the name and I've got the telephone number. And he gave it to me. And it was the name of a gentleman, Gunvantla Shah, from North Bergen, New Jersey. He was the center of this case. Maan Singh, all of the other people that we found in the book could not operate without him because typically these passengers were paying $25,000, $30,000 to be smuggled. Well, they didn't have it. They don't have that money in India or Pakistan or those countries. That's why they're coming here. So, but they have relatives or they have businesses here that sponsor them. They pay the smuggling fee. So to pay the smuggling fee, you have to pay the hawala broker here in the United States. And then the broker gives word to the smugglers along the route, whether they're starting in India or in their Maan Singh in Ecuador, that it's okay to move them. So we found Gunvant Shaw in North Bergen, and we started investigating them. We didn't get cooperation from our Newark office, but what we did is put on a pen register. For those who don't know, it's what goes on a phone line before a wiretap. You get all of the data, all of the calls live, but you don't get the sound. You can't listen to the phone. So that's a prerequisite for a wiretap. We did that, and we started studying the data, and then we did what we call tickling the wire. We would move loads of people. We would arrange for undercover meetings with Gunvant or with Maan Singh, and then we watch how the traffic was on the phone. And eventually we ended up being able to get a wiretap on this gentleman. It was the very first wiretap that INS ever did, and I don't think they did many more before.
Can I ask, what was his status?
He was naturalized. No, he was a permanent resident.
Permanent
resident. One thing about this photo, I'll tell you right before, this is a funny story. See the tree right there in the very corner of the picture? Well, we put a pole camera on his house to watch him come and go as we listened to him talk, and that tree was in the way. So our technical agent that was detailed up there from Denver, Colorado, decided to cut it down. At the end of the case, INS bought that tree. We had to give the city of North Bergen, New Jersey, $10,000 for that tree.
And of course,
Probably environmental violation too.
he did not ask for permission, by the way. But you know, the important thing about that particular picture, you look at that picture in New Jersey, nondescript location. Nobody's ever going to think of the center of activity that's going on in there. And I think when we finally got the wire going, and AJ can talk a little bit more about the wire, I think we're having like 200 phone calls a day from that particular location. As a matter of fact, when we got the wire authorized, that there's a stringent procedure, that write-up that you have to do, the justification, because that's one of the beautiful things about our country, Mark, that we respect the privacy of everybody inside the country. So we worked diligently, and certainly AJ and Mark Sanders, one of the other agents, in getting this authorization from a federal judge. But we turned on the switch, and I'll show you a picture of the symbolic day that we turned on the switch. And as soon as we turned on the switch, there was a fax that came in within 3 or 5 seconds of a transfer of $150,000. And as you can imagine, as young agents, we said, yes. Yeah, so because we were right in what we were pursuing, and it took off from there. I'm going to let AJ talk a little bit about the players here. I think we wanted to share these pictures because when you see the pictures of these players, I think it shows the story.
I'm going to start in the middle. The middle is Carlos Martinez. He's passed away now, so we can talk about it. He was our informant. He was the guy called 5 times a day. He was a magnificent alien smuggler before he was convinced to work for the United States government. I think his detention might have convinced him that way. He came over to our side. Anyways, he was a magnificent smuggler, and then he became an informant, and he was a very good informant. He was good up until the day he passed away. He was in contact with every one of these people. He was kind of the center of the wheel. Him and the gentleman over on the far left, upper with the turban, that's Nabtej Sandhu, and they were partners, alien smugglings, in a case that Poli took down. This is the very first case where the United States government was able to do a rendition, which means take Carlos and Sandhu from Nicaragua and bring them to the United States so they could be prosecuted. He joined the conspiracy. He had aliens on that boat, the vessel, the El Almirante, and then he also delivered them through Carlos to our American Airlines scheme. The middle is Maan Singh, Naranjan Maan Singh. That's what he looked like when he was finally arrested in Miami. He was he was the guy. He taught all these people how to smuggle. They worked for him at one time, and then they became competitors, but still they used each other's routes and pipelines as they went along. Nick Diaz is an interesting character right here on the right. His name was Nitin Shetty. He went by Nick Diaz because he spent time in Colombia and he admired Pablo Escobar. He actually even dated a niece or something of Pablo Escobar one time. He was somebody that the United States government only knew a name. Nobody had a picture of him. We had no idea who he was until Poli met with him in a hotel room undercover in Quito, Ecuador. I was in the other room with the videotape, and when he said, "Nobody has my picture, not even the CIA," I went, "Yes, we do now." His partner right here in the bottom was Gulu Abdul Farouk. He was just a person coming to the United States. He happened to be an accountant in India, and when he got to the Bahamas, Nick Diaz recruited him to stay and work for his organization. He was the guy who ran the money. And of course, the guy on the far bottom is the pilot. He was the commercial pilot who started this case. I want everybody to take a good look at him. Remember his face, because when I became involved, he was he cooperated with the government after he was arrested. And he was kind of running willy-nilly, making phone calls. He lived in the Dallas Metroplex. The agent running him was out of McAllen, so they brought me into the case, and I would go over to his apartment in Hearst, which is a suburb of Dallas, and we would make calls, and I would record them so we keep the chain of evidence. While we were waiting for bad guys to call us back, he would get on his flight simulator, and he crashed every time. And I said to myself, you want to be a commercial pilot? So I keep that in my memory. If I ever get on an airplane and he's the pilot greeting me at the door, I'm getting off. But he is a commercial pilot now. He flies for airlines in Turkey. He hasn't been able to come back to the United States. He would love to come back and fly for one of our airlines, but he hasn't been able to get back.
So
here.
the motto is avoid Turkish Airlines.
Just a note to add on him. He came originally to the United States on a student visa, and paid someone to marry him so that he could stay with a green card. There's always a marriage fraud case in every big case.
Yep.
This is this was the center of activity for Mr. Maan Singh in Quito, Ecuador. Maan Singh had a great operation, but he still needed somebody with local ties, and the local ties in Quito, Ecuador was Francisco Mera. He's the owner of this little hotel here. They call it Hostal. I can't remember how many rooms they had, but it was the center of activity for the migrants coming in. When they would first arrive, they would house them there and ultimately take them out into houses within the community. And when I first got started, AJ was talking about Carlos Martinez, our informant, and Naftesh Sandhu. I did an undercover operation when I was the officer in charge in Monterrey, Mexico, and Mr. Sandhu and Carlos Martinez fled to Nicaragua. Ultimately, we were able to track them down, and Interpol in Nicaragua was willing to work with us. I was having a good time in Ciudad Juarez, where I had transferred as head of the office there, and they called me up and they said, we have these two people located here. You have a warrant for their arrest. You can have them. That had never been done in our agency. And I said, well, fantastic. And said, and you have to get them out by tomorrow. And so I was in Ciudad Juarez by El Paso, no direct flights into Nicaragua. And I mentioned this story because of what we did before. We would go after the smugglers right on the border, inside the United States, and I've always professed the security of our border goes way beyond our border. It doesn't start there. It starts in Quito, Ecuador. It starts in Nicaragua. So I had no idea how I was going to do it, but I said, I'll go pick them up. I called Washington, D.C., our headquarters, and they said, absolutely not. I bought the ticket. I had to get clearance from the regional security officer, and it just so happened that he was an individual that I knew, Lenny Bernier, who was a great regional security officer of the State Department. He authorized entry into Nicaragua. Long story short, by the end of that night, I was in Nicaragua working alone. We're working with agents from another country that I did not know. I had no weapon and no backup. And and it didn't hit on me. It didn't hit me until I was out in Managua, and the power was out, and it's completely dark. And I realized, what am I going to do if something happens? We arrested Sandhu and ultimately Carlos Martinez and brought him into the country. But I mentioned this because Carlos Martinez, when he was in custody in South Texas, he decided that he was going to switch sides. Carlos Martinez started smuggling when he was 19 years old in southern Mexico, one of the most prolific and successful smugglers operating out of Mexico. He knew every single major operative in Mexico. And he kept telling agents in South Texas, I want to talk to somebody about this because I want to work with you guys. They blew him off. At that same time, I had a heart attack. And so, as Jessica will tell you from working with the State Department, you had to be medically cleared to work in a foreign mission. So my clearance was revoked because I could not come back to work. So I had a choice. Send somebody to talk to Carlos Martinez. I couldn't come on duty. I couldn't buy a ticket on government funds. So I took some time off, and I flew down on my own and met Carlos Martinez in South Texas, and ultimately ended up with him in Quito, Ecuador. I was the first person who ever laid eyes from the U.S. government on Niranjan Maan Singh when I had a drink with him at this hotel in Quito, Ecuador. And from there, we took off. Like AJ was mentioning, we had a meeting in South Texas, started developing the case. There's Mr. Sandhu on one of the boats, and I think when you look at Sandhu, this picture tells you a lot. Look at the person standing next to him, how comfortable he feels where he's at. He feels protected. He felt that he could be operating. This is the wire room. We were not as high tech as it is nowadays with the elaborate systems that folks nowadays. But on your left, you have a dynamic assistant U.S. attorney, Matt Yarbrough, who was willing to take the case and actually came to Washington with us to make the presentation before the Department of Justice Undercover Review Committee when we were turned down. Mike Dusenberry, a great technical agent, and of course AJ and myself. And you can see I still have black hair. Nitin Shetty, I think AJ has told you a little bit about him. This is a picture. One of the things that I want to mention is that we have a lot of great folks in our country. We have a lot of agents. Susan Rivera is one of those agents. She's still an agent in the government. She was willing to go undercover with me outside the country. Why did we need a female to go? One, you can have a female as a partner. She was a great shot, a better shot than I was. Fantastic shape and a beautiful person, and just a very dynamic, talented individual. On my right is an individual that AJ described to you earlier, Gulu. We are in the Bahamas. He was the accountant for the organization, and he took us into his confidence, and we were able to get a substantial amount of information of how it operated, the phone calls that were coming in. I mentioned before that there was 200 phone calls a day going into the New Jersey apartment, but I think AJ can tell you how busy it was because AJ was actually in the house when the arrest was done in the Bahamas. And you want to talk about the phone call that came in while you were there, AJ?
Well, when we went into this, it's a long story how we got to this house in the Bahamas. When we finally got there, Nick Diaz was trying to blend in in a line. They were walking, the Bahamian officers were walking the aliens out who were hiding in the bedroom. There were probably about 25 of them, and Nick was hiding in the line. And he had a ponytail, and he had it tucked in the back of his shirt, and I was standing there, and I grabbed him. Because remember what I said, how he said nobody had ever seen him? And I got you expletives. Pulled him out of the line. And so then the Bahamian officers took him aside. They put all the aliens in the garage to keep them together. And while I was standing there, we had an undercover operation going on in Fort Lauderdale where Nick's organization was going to be sending a group of aliens by boat to our undercover agents who were waiting there in one of those boathouses on the docks in Fort Lauderdale. And the phone kept ringing and ringing. So I picked it up and answered it. Just, bueno. And it was our undercover agent calling. He's calling for Nick. And he goes, AJ? George? What are you doing there? I said, we just got him. We just grabbed him. And he goes, great. But they had no idea that what we were doing. The phone just rang steady while we were there. Finally, I think we do this in all undercover operations, whether it be a drug house or whatever. If the phone keeps ringing, you pick it up. You never know who's on the other. Maybe Pablo Escobar on the other end. So that was just a lucky for us that we were able to catch him at that time.
And we talk a lot about a lot of the fun stuff, a lot of the serious stuff, a lot of the risky stuff that came in, and it's a great story to share. And we'll come back to the relevancy of what it means today, because I think that's one of the things that's important, Jessica and Marco. How is it relevant today? These are fun stories, and I think we'll share just a couple more war stories, and then we'll come back to why we're here today. When we were working in the Bahamas, by the way, we were going to take the arrest down. It turns out that the Bahamian official assigned to work with us was being paid by Nick Diaz. He didn't know that I was an undercover agent until the night that we were supposed to arrest him. He had just been paid $10,000 by Nick Diaz, and then he was led by our agents to arrest Nick, and he refused to do so. And that's you'll read in the book that AJ stayed up all night, and we were ultimately successful in getting that because of the persistence of AJ, and again by not taking no for an answer. But before we got to that particular point, when we work outside the country, especially on cases like this or any mission that you undertake, you had to get approval from the U.S. ambassador. You have to get approval from the deputy chief of mission. They had to bless your travel into the country. You had to get clearance. We don't just show up in the Bahamas we had an issue in the Bahamas because Nick Diaz was well entrenched. He was paying off officials at the airport. He was paying officials with the police department. You can't operate a business where you're doing $2 million a month of illegal activity without taking care of a lot of terrorists, if you want to call them as such. But we had to go in and brief the ambassador and the deputy chief of mission. We also had to notify the host country government because we don't have authority to work in a foreign country. We have to respect those laws as well. So many times you can't work undercover because perhaps you can't trust the individuals that you had to brief, whether it's our counterparts, law enforcement, the prosecutors. So we had to find a mechanism to do so. We went and briefed the deputy chief of mission and the ambassador on what the operation was, and they wholeheartedly supported what we were doing. But they also needed to brief one of the senior officials from the Bahamian government. I think she was like the equivalent of the
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister. And we couldn't just go over and travel openly to go brief her because, of course, then people would see us. So AJ had to masquerade as the boyfriend of the deputy chief of mission at a diplomatic,
One of my better assignments.
on a diplomatic party. So I don't know if you wanted to just.
Well, the irony of it is Polly was the diplomat, and I was the agent. I'd never done any of that. I was a field agent here in Dallas, Texas. So I didn't have a jacket. I didn't have a tie. I had to borrow stuff from people. And so when I went and met her, I was kind of overwhelmed because they called her the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but later the Prime Minister. Very nice lady, but they take me into her palace, and she had a receiving room, and I'd only seen that stuff on movies. I'd never been in one. So we sit there, and they have all the people come, and then they move us into another room, and she came out. Very nice lady. Told her what was going on. She listened, and then she asked me one question. She asked me if there were people in her government who knew what was going on. And I'd been briefed on protocols by the deputy chief of mission before I went in there and, told, don't ask for a Bud Light if they ask you if you want something to drink. And I just looked at the deputy chief and I said, yes, ma'am. And she goes, that's what I was afraid of. And she said, well, you have my permission to do whatever you have to do. Let me do some work and I'll get back to the deputy chief of mission. So we walked out and the deputy chief she just shook her head because she was like, I was so afraid how you were going to answer that question. But weeks later, we actually set up a meeting where Polly was meeting with Nick Diaz and his goon squad. And the deputy chief of mission called me and she says, we've got to go see the Prime Minister right away. Meet me at the embassy. So I went over there and she took me to the Bacardi plantation. They were having a high lunch. And the Prime Minister was the guest of honor. Again, I went as her boyfriend, borrowed my clothes. And, they had, it was a good meal and free rum and a Cuban cigar. It was the first Cuban cigar I've ever smoked. I got a little bit of dizzy off of it. But finally, we went through the receiving line. And as we went up to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Deputy Chief of Mission said, you remember my friend? And she says, yes, I do. Get him out of my country, talking about the crook. He said, and that was all she said. And we walked away. And that's when the whole thing started, negotiating with the National Police of the Bahamas and stuff like that. But we got her permission, and that was as simple as it was.
And just to share some of the risks, and then we'll get to this particular slide. As they were transporting Nick Diaz, AJ had quite a task to get Nick Diaz arrested. As they're taking him, we learned later on from Nick Diaz himself that they were thinking about killing both you and Nick Diaz, the officials that we were working with, except for the fact that the orders had come down directly from the Prime Minister. AJ had no backup. He was with the National Police out of the Bahamas, out in the middle of nowhere. So it kind of gives you an idea. We talk about the good stories. It's a serious matter, and I want to get back, and so just so we can open it up for questions if it's okay. There was dangers for our country, and AJ and I wrote a paper that we did not release called "Dangers at Our Nation's Back Door." Maan Singh was operating in Ecuador. There's other organizations that have been operating in Panama that bring all types of nationalities into the country. And there's a risk for our country. I spent 30 years working on immigration, on criminal enforcement, asylum, benefits, and the great majority of the people that I've had a chance to encounter during that career, even some of the criminals, were okay. Many great people coming to the country to make our country a lot better. The problem that we always have, that we have this today as well, is a small number can do a great amount of damage. Terrorist organizations can be patient. When A.J. was talking about a group traveling through South America that can take a year or 2 years, who is vetting that individual? Who knows that that person perhaps has different intentions when they're coming to the United States? Who knows what the smugglers' intentions are? We know that from Maan Singh, he did not care what these people were coming for the country for. All he knew that he was going to be paid, and he demanded to be paid. He didn't care what the intentions were, and they were not going to check. And certainly, anybody coming to the country to do us harm is not going to announce that they're doing it such. So that danger was there then, and we see it now. You see some of the things that have happened recently when you see individuals that when you look at the first individual that we have up there providing material support to ISIS, and he was indicted in Houston, born in Iraq, came into the United States in 2009 as a refugee. It's hard to tell. Other individuals that you see that an individual born in Bangladesh, do we know for sure? Do we vet people that spend 2 or 3 years at locations that apply for refugee status? Do we release people that cross the border from Mexico without knowing what their true intentions are? We have our concerns, but we could talk all day about the case, and we love talking about it, but we prefer that you learn about it from our book. But in the meantime, I'd like to open it up for questions if it's okay.